is it? Where is it? Where is it? Wait lang po. Cancel, cancel, cancel. Hmm. So some of the students of Doc M will be joining us. So we share the Zoom details to some students. Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our class. We are in a special topics graduate course, VMED 291. Before we proceed, let me introduce to you our esteemed speaker. This is actually my second time already to introduce her to the crowd and to our audience. She graduated and obtained her Doctor of Veterinary Medicine at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, last April 1999, and qualified as a veterinarian of the same year. She received her diploma for endangered species management from the Duro Wildlife Conservation Trust and the University of Kent at Canterbury with distinctions last 2001. And in 2015, she graduated and obtained her Master of Science in Wildlife Studies from the University of the Philippines as well. She has several work experiences, including, of course, the most recent, our department chair here in our Department of Veterinary Clinical Sciences, College of Veterinary Medicine, UPLB, where she is also working as an assistant professor. She serves as a coordinator of the Office of the Anti-Sexual Harassment, PPLB, from 2012, and she assisted in the various of zoos, wildlife rescue centers, and conservation organizations in the country and abroad in her varying capacities. And early on, she worked for Fauna and Flora International in varying capacities as well from 2003. From 2005 to 2008, working as a coordinator for the threatened species conservation breeding programs of the same organization. And for, I believe this is her first work, she worked as a curator veterinarian for several institutions as well. She has several achievements. She's really also one of my colleagues that I look up to. She is a very effective leader and a wonderful working mom, okay? Also part of my support system as I joined motherhood years ago, okay? Her skills, okay, among those that I have already mentioned earlier are spoken and written Italian, Visayan, Hiligaynon, and basic German. So she is a linguist, and she is also a PADI accredited diver and licensed non-professional driver. Okay, without further ado, we are seeing here her dog. I forgot the name, Doc M. What's the name of your dog again?
Manolo.
Yes, Manolo. Manolo. So, letter M. Manolo. Okay, let's welcome Dr. Emilia Elastica Ternura. Thank you for joining us, Doc.
Thank you rin po for inviting me.
Okay, you may have the screen. You may share na po.
Okay. Thank you. So before I begin, let me just say that this presentation was presented to the National Advisory Committee for Animal Disease Emergency and Control last week, actually. Let's start. Ngayon ko kung mag-work yung aking ngayon kung kailangan ko siya, hindi siya trabaho. Let's see. Lag yung computer ko. Sorry.
Sometimes it happens, no? Frustrating, but
Yun nga. I think I have too many stuff here. Okay, so let's start. So I presented this paper or this lecture as to answer the invitation of the National Advisory Committee on Animal Diseases Control Emergency. They found that we recently held disease risk assessment for ASF in Philippine wild pigs, because there was a case of ASF in Philippine warty pig, first in Mindanao and then in Abra in 2021. No? So they asked me to present this. So we think of ASF and instantly think about food security and economic security, no, and also maybe a little political issue, no, but then we don't think about it as a conservation issue and a One Health issue. So in reality, we in the conservation community actually believe that ASF is indeed a One Health issue. If we think about the origins of One Health, it started in the conservation community and they called it conservation medicine, no. So obviously, right now, One Health is a byword, no, used by human medicine as well as animal medicine. And as veterinarians, it's important to us to understand this concept, no, because we have in our hands the future health of both animals and humans. But if we think about it, conservation medicine is actually a holistic approach to medicine that does not just zone in on human med, which most of the time One Health is. So what's the difference between conservation med and One Health? First, we define it. So One Health is an interdisciplinary field that studies the relationship among these things: animal health, human health, and environmental conditions. And the difference between One Health and conservation medicine is nothing. It's actually One Health, but the focus is different because conservation medicine focuses mostly on how wildlife or environmental health impacts human health. So unfortunately, most of the discussion like surrounding One Health is human focused, if you notice it, no? A lot of the studies that are enveloped by One Health have something to do with malaria, for instance. And AMR, kasama din yon, yung study ni Doc Maying, no? But it's really important to look at the origins because we need to recognize the link between human, domestic animal health, and wildlife health. And that this interconnection and the diseases that are threats to people, food supplies, and economies also affect wildlife. No? And we need to understand that biodiversity is essential to maintain these healthy environments para yung environment natin and ecosystem will continue to function normally. And this was stated by wildlife veterinarians in the Manhattan Principles by the Wildlife Conservation Society. These are a group of American veterinarians working for conservation, and they were the idea of One Health came from them. So according to Wendell et al., factors that drive EIDs, there are 4 of them, no? And if we notice, I mean, originally we'd think that these factors are pathogen host environment. That's what we learned in vet school. But slowly, because of the holistic nature of emerging infectious diseases, there is a big influence of politics in this, no? Because we need to recognize that emerging infectious diseases have social impacts and political impacts as well. And I'm sure you feel it right now when we are in this world or global pandemic. No? So when we talk about ecological health as a component of One Health, we need to define what is healthy. And the World Health Organization recognizes that ecological health and defining healthy does not necessarily mean absence of disease. It also implies that the health involves both living and non-living components, and it recognizes the relationship of human activity to ecological change and health. That humans have a big impact on ecological health. That's why it identifies human activity as a major impact on the health of the planet. And when we say ecological distress syndrome, this is an actual term, no, that was coined in 2000. It's a collection of symptoms or signs that an ecosystem is being pushed to its limit. And it precedes the transformation of an ecosystem into something less productive. We see some of the signs right now, no, like acid rain or drought, or when droughts are longer than usual, when there are big die-offs of whole populations, this is a sign of ecological distress syndrome. So symptoms of ecological distress syndrome is loss of biological vitality, when your ecosystem cannot handle or cannot support life anymore. Global toxification, and we see this in the world as signs of how many people now are getting asthma or pneumonia. Global climate change is very real, and of course increased ecological footprint. Why? Because people demand so much from the earth, no? And if we think about it, EDS, or this environmental distress syndrome, is precluded by emerging infectious diseases. So notice how many diseases have come up within the last century. It's not as common as like before, when before we're being introduced slowly, but now we are being bombarded by pandemics that parallel each other. Right now, we are in COVID, but we haven't finished the ASF pandemic yet before COVID arrived. So what do we know? And I love this line: are we Jon Snow, who know nothing? We know that the Philippines has high biodiversity. We also know that our country has high levels of threat to biodiversity. And because of how we are located in the world, we also know that we're very much susceptible to climate change. And let's face it, we all know that we have a poor social system and lack of political will. So we also know that we have at least 4 known species of wild pigs in the Philippines. These are species that have been described. No? So one of them is this one on top. It's vulnerable from Mindoro, the Sus oliveri, it was named after my former boss, William Oliver. The non-threatened or near-threatened Sus ahenobarbus from Palawan. The critically endangered Sus sebifrons from Negros, Panay, now extinct in Cebu. The vulnerable Sus philippensis that's distributed from Luzon, Samar, Leyte, and Mindanao. And the data deficient Sus espinov. Wala pa po siyang pangalan. And this pig comes from Sulu. So we call it the Suluwarte pig, but it hasn't been described as of now. So having known that, we know that the Philippines is also the second most important country in terms of pig diversity. Indonesia yung number 1 because they have the babirusa and they have the bearded pig, etc. And conservation of wild pigs are related to how we also manage backyard pigs. So question for the participants, which of these pigs do you think is a hybrid? Is it the one on top, or the one here with its head held up, or these two down below?
Anybody? If no one wants to answer, I will answer. I don't have a clear picture, pero I would say this upright picture here on the left side.
Try ko ay, hindi. Okay, so the one like upright is the purebred Visayan Warte pig. So the one on top, the one that shares like 2 photos, are hybrids. And this occurs because of how we manage pigs in the backyard farms. because we just, tie them up, and sometimes wild pigs come over because they are foragers and then mate with our native or domestic pigs. I've actually seen a specimen of a hybrid pig that came from the wild, and it looked like a duroc with big floppy ears. So the reason why Visayan warty pigs are critically endangered is because of genetic contamination. And this phenomenon is also related on how we perceive ASF can spread from domestic pigs to the wild. So in last year, Luskin et al. Looked at the pig ranges of the important pigs in the world, no? And checked how many of these pigs are very high risk. If you can see this, or if you can check Luskin et al. 2000, it will tell you that all four known pigs, uh, so three pigs that we have are all at a very high risk of extinction because of ASF. And then one is at high risk, which is Sus ahenobarbus. No? And this really tells us how much of an emergency this is. But when did ASF arrive? It arrived in 2019. Before ASF arrived, so when was VPAP convention? During the VPAP convention in June, I already warned the veterinarians about this. And it's very real, but of course, even in 2020, when late 2019, when I attended a PVMA convention in Mindanao, the data surrounding the possibility of wild pigs becoming extinct is still sketchy, no? And it has been, and I told this to the National Advisory Committee, it has been mostly ignored, the importance of wild pigs, no, in relation to ASF spread and if ASF stays in the country. So we all know that African swine fever is also an emerging infectious disease in many countries, because even if it's endemic to Africa, it only recently reached the shores of most of Asia. No? So we know that even during the 1800s, people already know about African swine fever. But Philippine pigs are naive to this. And so our wild pigs are also naive. So if we look at the map, this is a map from June 22, 2021, declaring which spots in the Philippines are infected by African swine fever. I overimposed the distribution of Philippine warty pigs and the rest of the wild pigs that we have in the Philippines. And if we notice, Philippine warty pigs, they are termed vulnerable under the IUCN. They have more chances of winning ASF because of their distribution map. Although they are the most widely distributed, they're also distributed along the highway which ASF occurs. No? In January 2021, a former colleague, a former classmate of mine who works in Digos phoned me because she knew I worked with wild pigs to report that there were 9 pigs in a private forest, in Digos, that were found dead in the forest. And what should we do? So immediately we set up a meeting, talking with the owners of this forest, DNR, and representatives of BAI. Unfortunately, right now, there was a survey in this same forest. They cannot find any Philippine warty pig there anymore. And then in March 2021, in Abra, there were reports of hunters going into the forest and finding dead pigs. But, hunters, they were happy because they didn't have to hunt. So they brought the pig meat home and fed it to their families, after which an outbreak occurred in their locality. So domestic animals began to die. That was the report. And sadly, when I saw that report, one of the conclusions was ASF came from the wild pigs. So we need to look at like the scenario much more clear, holistically. Because when did ASF arrived in the Philippines? 2019. And before that, obviously, if there was ASF before 2019 in the wild pigs, then we would have had ASF before 2019 sporadically, di ba? So I really don't buy that. Sorry. Ang sama ko ba? Ayun. But if we look at these so far two cases, the question is, are we already doomed? Like in the point of view of conservation, are we doomed? And as someone working with wild pigs and someone who sees the reality of how people manage backyard pigs, I could say that we might get there. At least for, Philippine warty pigs. The highway that distributes ASF also distributes illegal wildlife trade, drugs, diba? So, nandun lahat yan sa daang Maharlika. So, if we do not control that, if we don't, like I don't see the red zones becoming green in the near future, but I could see that it's possible if we band together to at least maintain the green zones green. And the green zones are really important because they hold the critically endangered Visayas warty pig, the endemic Mindoro warty pig, and the Philippine bearded pig. But then the reality is, looking at how we are as a country, how we are as a political system, and how we are as a social system, I think eventually they will cross the waters. Hindi, not because maraming pasaway, not because of that, but because we do not have like a sense of urgency, and we do not have a sense of like common good when we do our dealings. So in 2020, Borneo also declared that they have ASF. And because of that, there has become a population sink in the population of bearded pigs on Borneo. After several months, the wildlife division of Sabah did the survey, and they saw pockets of population. So there will be two realities there. So what's our reality right now? No? We know that most pathogens are associated with high areas of biodiversity and human-centered activity, like the Philippines. No? We also know that most human and livestock emerging infectious diseases can infect wildlife, like ASF, like Marek's disease, like ND, like ILT, because these are diseases that we've seen in wildlife. They weren't there before, but it's there now. We know that the focus of attention is on human-centered One Health approaches. And because of that, we tend to put wild animal health in the backseat. So the full severity of emerging infectious disease outbreaks and their impacts are often overlooked and underestimated because we don't put wild animals there on the table. When I spoke to a representative of the NAC, some months ago, no one in this committee could explain to them the ecology of the Philippine or of Philippine wild pigs, in general. And this is really, for me, a glaring information that wildlife or wild animal health is actually treated as some sort of novelty, which shouldn't be. Because if we're looking at One Health, this should be in the spotlight. So our reality, this is an egret with Marek's disease. It tested positive on PCR as well as on We didn't do serology on this animal, but it's there. And the animal, when we saw it, found it, it looked healthy. It was fighting back. It was healthy. So a lot of the wildlife that have these diseases are actually asymptomatic. So we have yet to characterize the virus and determine whether it came from, like the wild or from vaccines. So another reality is that ASF may extirpate or, render extinct all our pigs, all our wild pigs. And all the Philippine wild pigs are naive to the virus. And thus, the result would be, for now, what we see is a population sink for Sus philippensis. So population sink means that there will be pockets, based on the Borneo case, there will be pockets of Sus philippensis that will survive. We won't know, like in Borneo, they still don't know if the surviving populations have the virus. But if they do have the virus, it's more likely that these sinks will become reservoir in the future. So this is why it's really important to protect our wild pigs from ASF. We don't want a prolonged disease pandemic for our pigs. Did you know that when ASF reached South Korea, they began to deploy drones and snipers to shoot all the pigs coming in from North Korea? And the experience in Africa and Europe shows that this will not work. Culling wild pigs will just make the situation graver. Because then infected pigs that are, still apparently healthy might disperse and spread the disease further. So it's really possible that extinctions might happen if we're not careful. To look at the long-term effects of ASF, I think one of the problems with us as a population is we don't look long-term. We only look at what's in it for us financially, like I have to sell all these pigs right away, la la la. So, but then if you look at it, the long-term effects are much more scary. So if there is ASF in wild pigs, the populations will decline and it will result in an altered ecology because pigs are known to be ecosystem engineers. They root, diba? They change the landscape. They recruit seedlings. They are seed spreaders. And so later on, maybe not next year or in 2 years, maybe in 10 years, the socioeconomic impacts will be felt. And the things that we will lose when these pigs disappear are grave. Talagang malaki siya, no? Because then the pigs that create habitat conditions to provide, an increase in biodiversity, they will be gone. There is no other animal that can cover their role in our forest. It's the role of the pigs, and that's it. Seed and plant propagation will go down, and there will be a reduction of pest species and carrion because it is the pigs who eat these species in the forest. Of course, there will be less food source for predators and humans. So in our case, there are no big predators for wild pigs, but wild pigs are also sources of proteins for humans. So what we see or what we hope to lose is that we lose food security and, like apart from biodiversity, we also lose economic stability later. So Luskin recommends that in all cases, proper carcass disposal and waste disposal is practiced, not just in the farms, but also when you find wild pigs. And the surveillance measure should include wild pigs. We need to adhere to strict biosecurity measures in the farms, and this includes farms that are backyard farms, no? And we need to engage the public. How many of you have seen adverts related to ASF on TV or on radio? Wala, di ba? And it's really disappointing because this is still a pandemic. There is still a pandemic of ASF. We need to strengthen through research and capacity building. But in research and capacity building, we need to include conservation organizations as well as indigenous peoples groups, because they're the ones who are in the front line of wild pig surveillance. No? And the collaboration should be interdisciplinary. We should not exclude anyone. I remember one of the people when I presented this lecture, one of the people represented there said, maybe we shouldn't talk to backyard farmers anymore because they don't listen anyway. But these people are your front lines. They are the key to surveillance. They are the key to prevention and, mitigation. And maybe the engagement has something wrong with it. Maybe the manner of communication is lacking. Maybe, we did not communicate enough. I don't know. But we have to look at how we communicate and what communication channels we use in order to make sure that the backyard farms are included. So after the DRA, the general recommendations are to maintain green areas green. We learned a lot from the experience of my colleague. Oh my God, he's my colleague, but I forgot his name. Parag Jeka. Parag started with the Pygmy Hog Conservation Program in the same year that I started with the wild pigs, no? And so we haven't met at all, but we go a long way working together for wild pig conservation. And right now there is African swine fever in India, and they have actually prevented ASF from infecting their herds, no? So they're right now reintroducing the pygmy hogs in the wild. So it's really important to maintain green areas green and identify all the stakeholders involved. And we need to revisit the critical control points, meaning at what point will ASF cross to the green zones, or at what point will ASF be prevented? We need to improve communication, of course, and because then again, we need to include all those stakeholders and strengthen these collaborations. So during the meeting with NAC ADSE, I was asked to identify additional stakeholders for the task force, because really important, to work together, because the animals affected by ASF are not just domestic pigs. So, and then recently there was a communique by the IUCN, FAO, and OIE. It's a joint communique declaring ASF as a conservation concern. But apart from that, we have to recognize that ASF is a One Health concern because it's a danger to food security and economic stability. Thank you for listening. That's all, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, Doc M, for, of course, another very informational video lecture about the wild pigs, One Health, and ASF. We are now going to entertain questions from our graduate students. Let's start with Dr. Racho.
Hi, Doc. Good afternoon po. Doc, actually wala akong masyadong maisip na very specific question since ang hirap, hindi rin ako super familiar, and ang hirap nung mangialam actually or mag-comment sa ano po yung sa topic. So kung sakali ba, Doc, ano yung like kunwari sa atin sa college or any for the academe, what do you think would be could be our role siguro sa pagdating sa ganitong problem?
I think research plays a very important role. Kasi ang dami pang loopholes sa research regarding ASF. So doon tayo papasok. I know that currently we have something going on with surveillance. No? Pero yun nga, I was supposed to be in on that research. But when they presented the study, tinanggal nila yung wildlife component.
So, yun nga, Doc.
Ang
So,
saya.
parang,
ang saya. So, I have two MS students who will do the surveillance in Bicol. Because we don't have to surveil wild pigs per se. We can surveil the farms or the backyard farms around the forest edges. If they're ASF free, then it's possible, that we have a fighting chance to keep the forest clear.
so,
Parang
Doc,
by association.
so if ever like, diba, hindi nga po masyado, let's say, hindi na focus for academic research, then what do you think, sino ba ang usually dapat parang magko-coordinate pag ganyan? Kasi ang problem din yan, just even sa local governments, is hindi rin siya kasama sa priority. So, who do we approach to be able to move forward to also, tawag dito, include this wildlife, the warty pigs in surveillance, and not only surveillance, but protection also for dun sa mga pigs.
I think one of the reasons why I agreed to talk to the NAC was this, not to put, somehow an emphasis on how urgent this concern is for wild pigs, but also for the domestic pigs that they, encounter. And hopefully things move forward from last week, no? So right now I'm kind of in a waiting game with the task force. We're finalizing the results of the DRA, but because we only had 3-day workshop, we couldn't really finish the whole thing. So we presented the participants with 2 scenarios because we exactly have those 2 scenarios in the Philippines. No? Scenario 1 was, what if you don't have ASF in your island, but there's ASF in the neighboring island? So we asked the participants to identify in which pathways will the virus take for the virus to come into your island. And it was very interesting to see many different points of view, because the way we manage ASF is that the national government looks at control points in the major highways only.
Yeah.
But during the workshop, we identified that there are possibilities of farmers bringing in pork, of fisher folk bringing in pork, because they have small bangkas that can travel between Cebu, let's say Cebu and Negros, Bohol and Negros, which may, baon tayo, pork, adobo, ganyan, and then, pasalubong. And it essentially bringing in the virus into households, no? So that's one thing. And the other scenario is that what if ASF is already there? Like what's happening in Luzon, in Mindanao, it's already there. What measure should we make to prevent it from reaching the wild areas? So yun yung 2 scenarios that we saw. And because of this DRA, we found that the communication pathways of both DENR and BAI are parallel. Pareho sila, the report, the provincial vet will report higher up and higher up, no, until it reaches the national government. And it's the same with the environment sector, yung DNR. But there was never an overlap. Parallel sila. So by the time it reaches, for instance,
action,
the communication pathway goes up like that, but never crosses.
No.
So at the provincial level, hindi pa malalaman sa provincial level ng isang department or ng isang agency na may outbreak na, kasi aabot mo na sa national. And by doing that, we lose so much time for, mitigation and control. And then also, what we also discovered is that, diba, ang gold standard natin ay PCR. So that means that we do not accept any other test result. But ELISA is available out there. And I think that, if people have access to that and it's much economical, then we have some sort of early detection somehow so that people can be more prepared. But, I don't know the reason behind why we don't use ELISA in the local settings yet, or it's not widely used. But it's something that, farmers, backyard farmers can have access to and use on their own for reporting at least. So, it's very interesting what the DRA, if I will submit an abstract to BIPAP regarding the results of the DRA. So, yeah.
Thank you, Doc.
You're welcome.
Doc F, for that very extensive answer to the question. We will now entertain a question from Dr. Jen Albano.
Good afternoon po, Doc.
Hi, Doc.
Opo. Dr. Nora po. What are the problems you have encountered po during your data collection po in wild animals po? Para just in case po, we plan to do a study also, we have an insight on what to expect po.
It will depend on the animal. Kasi like for wild pigs, it's really hard to collect from them. So you need to find the next best option. So isa-isahin natin. Kasi hindi, parang general yung question mo eh. So for pigs, because we cannot access the animal directly, we look for byproducts of the animal. Hair or feces is the best actually. Like if I meet any person serving the forest, I go penging tae. Because it's very easily identifiable. I mean, you can tell a pig feces from a deer feces right away. And we can isolate DNA from feces. So that's what we can look at. For, let's say, birds, mahirap yung feces because you cannot identify bird feces from one species to another. So yun, kailangan mong manghuli. So like for the egrets, I found out the hard way that they're really difficult to catch. It's easier to catch like passerines, no? Like mga, yan, yung mga shrike, hindi kami nakahuli ng maya ha. But we were able to catch brown shrike, long-tailed shrike, yan, mga mayayabang na mga maliliit na ibon na ang sakit mangagat, ganyan. But you also need to have the right people with you. Because we've caught bats as well, and you need to timing dapat. Importante yung timing kasi you will never catch a bat in the morning, di ba? So for morning, birds yung huhulihin mo, at night, bats yung huhulihin. For reptiles, kailangan magaling kang humabol. Kasi ang catching ng reptiles, madalang yung you set a trap and then they get trapped inside unless it's a drop trap. But for drop traps, maliit lang yung mahuhuli mong reptile. So habulan talaga siya. And always dakma method. Like, you actually dadakmain mo sila ng kamay mo. Ganon. Ayun. So, if wala siyang madaling way, there's no easy way to work with, wildlife in the wild. That's why if you want to work with wildlife, the first and easiest thing to do is work with wildlife in captivity. Yun muna. And then you develop like, parang from there, develop the study to wildlife in the wild. So it takes a lot of, ang laki ng budget. You need camping equipment, and then you need to determine how long you stay. And in this time of pandemic, it's almost impossible to go out in the field because IATF regulations changes from, one municipality to another. Ganyan. Pero the best would be to partner with an organization that already works in the field.
Present.
So for me, I never burnt bridges. Like, I still maintain my contacts from when before I arrived in the academy. So I still continue to work with them, and if they need my help, then I'm there for them. So I work with Philippine Wild Foundation, I work with Mabuaya Foundation, the Catala Foundation, I work with Negros Forest Park, work with a lot of organizations who need my help, so that when I need their help, then they're there for me too.
Very well given answer. Thank you for that, Doc M. By any chance, do we have any questions from our undergrad students? Anybody? If you're shy, you can put it in the chat box. Okay, while we're waiting for them, let me ask a question, Doc M. What, aside from those that you have mentioned already, what other researches can you think of to research more about this ASF outbreak that we have right now?
So first yung, surveillance. If you can't find wild pig feces, then go to, the backyard farm surrounding forest, but also find I think, an easy way to detect the virus in feces. Like a dipstick test or lateral flow test, mga ganon, di ba? So that, like, even a field worker who goes on surveys regularly, let's say the Tamaraw Conservation Group, they go on surveys regularly, they find feces, dip the stick, and then they have their answer. I think we really need that kind of test. Recently also, I've communicated with a vaccine developer who has started to develop a vaccine that they can leave in the wild for pigs to eat. So it's something along that line. But I don't see us going there yet because the priority of the national agency is not there. Hindi yun yung priority nila. Not to be a spoil sport. Pero yun sana yung maganda. Yun parang wish list yun. But I have feces.
With what you have mentioned, it sparked something in me, and this is to ask you how, what's your stand in vaccinating wildlife? Should they be vaccinated, or like, especially for this case, let's say ASF, we're rather than having them dead, it's better for them to be vaccinated. But in general, what's your stand on this?
So generally, I'm not for vaccination of wildlife, especially if the vaccines may revert, because it doesn't. And then, like, if you want to release the animal. But like for ASF, maybe okay lang, like in the red zones. Pero again, I don't see wildlife vaccination as a priority here. No, so what I see is prioritize vaccination in domestic animals, but surveil wild animals. Kasi ang nakakatakot sa vaccination din, baka sila, the vaccinated ones, become the reservoir. Yun yung scary. And you never know what the effect is. Because after vaccination, you let them free.
Yeah.
You won't, put them in you can't monitor anymore.
Yeah. True enough. Okay, do we have any final question out there? Yung hindi makakatulog na magtanong, anybody? Okay, kung wala na po, let's wrap it up. Thank you so much, Doc M, for joining us this afternoon, giving us a very enlightening lecture on One Health, ASF, and of course, wildlife. Okay, on behalf
Thank
of
you rin po.
291 Special Topics, we now end this session. Keep safe, everybody. God bless. Bye.
Salamat po.
Thank you,
Thank you po,
Doc.
Doc. Thank you po.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you, Ren.